How's it going, everybody? I'm back from a little vacation. In this case, I was gone getting married. Thanks everybody who sent their love over Twitter, YouTube, or in the Discord. And I should be back. So let's jump right in. Obviously, since I didn't do a tier list last week, we're not going to have the same reference points, but we're going to follow the same style that we've been doing previously, starting with F and M and D tier, and then we're going to jump up to S tier and work our way down to give you a broader view of the metagame. First up, there is one thing I want to mention. Throughout this video, you're going to notice a lot of different decks, a lot of different things. There is a deck specifically that is missing. It had 0 finishes in the prelims last week or the challenge top 16s. I don't think that means it is perhaps a bad deck that it drops immediately, but for the purposes of these tier lists, I only take the decks that finished with a top 16 in a challenge, a 3-1 or 4-0 in the prelims, or if there are big paper events, something from there. So you will notice Mono Green Karn did not actually place in any of those locations. Due to that, it does not go on the list this week. I wouldn't read too heavily into it. I think we're seeing a shift, as we'll mention at the top, but it is still a strong deck, but it's certainly starting to fall down in the tiers as we had kind of seen the last couple weeks. So let's start with the F and M tier decks. First up, we have Grixis Midrange. This is a mixing together of the various powerful cards in blue-red along with some of the powerful black cards like Fatal Push, Nicol Bolas Ravager. In reality, it sort of falls under the Grixis Pile banner. Don't quite think it's enough to make it higher on the list. Next up, we have Sultai Midrange, a collection of the powerful green-blue and green-black cards all thrown together. Similar to Grixis Pile's Sultai Pile doesn't quite have the tools to be efficient enough against a lot of the meta. Next up, we have Green-Black Stompy. This is a deck that 4-0 to prelim, shows up periodically just on the nature of having a lot of mana dorks on top of aggressive creatures. Solid enough, especially if you run into good matchups, but not generally a deck I would recommend. Last up in F&M tier, we have Mono Black Devotion. This is a deck that will pop up and continues to pop up here and there, but overall you're a little slow and clunky to be attacking tiered decks. Next up, we have the D tier. These are the decks that are below the standard I would recommend for bigger events. Obviously, they can, like F&M tier, do well at your local events or smaller events, but for challenges and things of that nature, I would stay away from these decks unless you have a particular reason to be playing them. First up, we have Niftalite. With only 1 top 16 this week and no prelim finishes, it was, in fact, the Dragon Master himself, Claudio, taking this to a top 16. Again, it is difficult to rank this deck particularly highly when the only pilot who seems to be able to take it to any level of reasonable finish is Claudio, making it not evidently as powerful a deck as he may make it seem. Next up, we have Blue-Black Control, which had a very strong finish for Blue-Black Control with a top 8 in Saturday's challenge. Blue-Black continues to pop up here and there, but in reality, it's really the 3rd best control deck, dedicated control deck in the format behind Blue-Red and Blue-White. I think you lose a lot of the powerful tools by not having access to Collective Defiance with your Narset, along with some of your threats being better, and then Blue-White with cards like Teferi and Absorb. Blue-Black can do reasonably depending on the meta, but it's always been a control deck that I think lacks in comparison to the other options. Next up, we have Mono Blue Spirits. A once top-tier deck has started to fall more and more. We're seeing a lot of cheap interaction, whether it be red removal or black removal. And one of the places where Mono Blue Spirits struggles the most is when you're able to trade up or even on mana, taking out their threats and then establishing your own. A lot of these decks, especially Ledger Shredder style decks, are heavily punishing Mono Blue Spirits. Next up, we have Boros Midrange. This put up a top 8, and that was the only finish. It's sort of similar to a white-black control deck or midrange deck we had played on stream before, except swapping the black cards for red. Honestly, I'm not sure why this style of deck, at least in the way it's presented currently, is a better option than some of the more dedicated control decks, but it is an interesting adaptation to see, and with the top 8, I'm curious to see if we see it any more moving forward, but until we get a little bit more time with this style of deck, unlikely to be moving much higher than D tier. Next up, we have Mono Red Aggro, which has also mightily fallen. I think, again, the rise of cheap interaction makes Mono Red a tricky deck to survive the meta. We aren't seeing quite as many decks that it wants to prey on, those sort of over-the-top decks that you can get under, things like Lotus Field and Blue-White Control. Most of the control decks and mid-range decks are able to interact with your creatures profitably, making it hard to get across the finish line as the red deck. Last up in D tier, we have Boros Heroic, which again, you'll notice a trend between Mono Blue Spirits, Mono Red Aggro, and Heroic here. The rise of cheap interaction means that these aggressive decks are less likely to be able to position themselves to win elongated games. All right, now we're going to jump right to the S tier. Quite a shakeup over the last couple weeks. We've seen, as I said, the rise of cheap interaction be the key in Pioneer right now. And in S tier, that mirrors it with red-black midrange, putting up 7 top finishes, including 6 top 16s in the challenge. Easily the best performance of the weekend, including winning Saturday's challenge. I think red-black midrange is able to fight many of the low-to-the-ground aggressive decks and also many of the Ledger Shredder style decks without giving up too much percentage against Winota. Where red-black is going to struggle is if we see a response in the amount of blue-white and blue-red control, which can go over the top of it and generally has a good matchup. We're starting to see those decks pick up. Again, blue-red control will be mentioned shortly, but unless blue-red control really spikes back to levels it was seeing before mono-green Karn really took over, red-black should be positioned to continually adapt itself into a good spot moving forward. Next up, we have blue-red control, which came first and second in Sunday's challenge, as well as putting up a 3rd place finish in Saturday's challenge with 5 top 16s, including 3 top 8s and a win. It's tough to deny that blue-red control had a great weekend, and with the fall off of mono-green Karn, right before that meta, we were seeing blue-red and blue-white dominate. Blue-red able to fight against a lot of the creature decks with your red removal, able to fight a lot of the control decks by leveraging Narset, Collective Defiance alongside Niv Mizzet Perun. Generally just one of the best multifaceted control decks in the format, and right now blue-red is a great spot to be, just having access to Expressive Iteration, Strangle, etc., Treasure Cruise, or Dig Through Time. Whatever choices you want to make, being blue-red as a base has proven to be a very strong position, with many top decks leveraging those cards right now. Next up, we move down to A tier. These are still decks that are incredibly impressive, likely to top 8. If they won the challenge, it wouldn't be shocking. Generally, their matchups don't always line up best against the S tier decks, or their representation is a little bit lower, and that keeps them from being S tier. First up, we have Winota, which has diversified into a build that includes Reflector Mage, thanks to Jonathan Hobbs on Twitter. That list came second in the challenge on Saturday, with another 3rd place finish on Sunday for the more traditional Winota build. We've seen a lot of Winota in the past couple weeks, but again, the rise of decks like red-black midrange, blue-red control, and other Ledger Shredder decks are going to make it difficult for Winota to be as powerful as it was when the meta was all about non-interaction. Now, everyone's pointing cheap interaction at each other. It's a lot tougher for a Winota to be able to take over the battlefield early, and in an extended game, these decks with Treasure Cruise, Expressive Iteration, etc. can go over the top much easier. Next up, we have Lotus Field, which continues to rise in the face of these control decks and the downfall of some of the aggro decks like Mono Red and Mono Blue, alongside Winota starting to take a little bit of a beating. We saw this before in the meta prior to Mono Green Karn. We saw Winota getting beat out by control, meaning Lotus Field was powerful, and with the adaptation of many can't be countered spells in your sideboard, you're able to effectively make the control matchup very easy. Means last time we saw a rotation of control into Lotus Field being the top deck leading to aggro, and that cycle continuing through until we hit Mono Green Karn as the top deck. Last up in A tier, we have Blue-Red Prowess. Again, as I mentioned, cheap interaction, Ledger Shredder, Expressive Iteration, Treasure Cruise, getting to play all of these incredibly powerful cards, keeping creature decks down through your interaction, and being able to sideboard into an aggro control deck, leading on your Swift Spears and your Soul Scars before countering key spells of interaction from your opponent. Prowess put up another strong weekend, not as impressive as last weekend or the weekend before, but now as people start to adjust to this deck in the meta, I think we will see it continue to be a represented top tier deck, but people will have more clean answers, especially in red-black midrange and blue-red control, being able to adequately answer the creatures and still reasonably fight through their backup plan. Next up, we have B tier. These are decks that either are not the best in their general archetypes. Usually you'll find decks that are powerful, but maybe there's a better color pair or a better style of this deck above it. They tend to be powerful enough to beat most of the D and F and M tier decks, but their matchups against S and A tier are generally a little bit skewed in those decks' favor. First up, we have Blue-White Control, which continues to show up off and on, again with a third place finish on Saturday. It's still putting up top level finishes with 2 top 16s this weekend, but compared to Blue-Red Control, it's not able to interact as cheaply or low to the ground, making it much tougher to deal with some of these decks that can still get under you, like Blue-Red Prowess, and Black-Red midrange able to interact with your hand to be able to take key spells. If you're not able to interact on early turns, you risk falling behind before a discard spell can take your key catch-up card. While Blue-White Control is favored into Rakdos midrange, I think into Blue-Red Control is very close, and the addition of the Narset lock is very problematic for Blue-White. Even though you have a lot of tools to beat it, often it's going to come down to exceedingly long games. Oftentimes when I played this matchup, it was decided by decking in game 1. And so I think Blue-Red being better against the general field means Blue-White is pushed down a little bit, just in nature of having some tougher times against the other Blue-Red decks and Lotus Field, along with just not being the best control deck in the format. Next up, we have Blue-Red Phoenix. Once again, we've seen 3 Blue-Red decks be in S, A, and B tier, and I think Blue-Red Phoenix is clinging on to Ledger Shredder, pulling it back up from being on the lower levels, but it still suffers from being a little bit clunkier than something like Blue-Red Prowess, and Blue-Red Control is able to more readily attack the metagame, whereas Blue-Red Phoenix might pick up some points as we see other control decks rise up. But as it sits, Blue-Red Phoenix is not the best option of your Blue-Red decks to attack the current metagame. And much like Blue-White Control, a good deck with strong finishes, in this case another 2 top 16s, that just is dwarfed by the other decks in its same archetype generally that are better right now. Finally, we have C tier. This week there's only one deck there, and that is sort of the gatekeeper between the D tier and F and M tier and the B tier. For me, decks in S and A tier are your front runners for the format at the moment. B tier tends to be other decks that you should be heavily expecting. They might be represented, they might be able to top 8. C tier are kind of the decks that might spike a top 8, unlikely to win, more likely to be found in the top 16, but they tend to be that buffer between the decks I wouldn't recommend and the decks I would. generally they'll have very divisive matchups between decks above it. In this case, Bant Spirits takes the mantle over Mono Blue Spirits this week by being able to generally attack some of the more 1-for-1 decks by having your creatures be your interaction alongside your Collected Company being a way to catch up against these 1-for-1 decks. Even so, I don't think Spirits is very well positioned against all of the blue-red running around, along with the prevalence of red-black midrange. I think if these 1-mana interactive spell decks are still staying towards the top of the meta, it will constantly make Spirits decks very difficult to operate. That's this week's tier list. As I had mentioned, Mono Green Karn and even Greasefang did not make it onto the list due to lack of finishes, so clearly I went away and got married, and a lot has changed. So let me know in the comments down below what you think is going to happen with the metagame moving forward now that we've seen a continuous shakeup. Some of the top decks that were dominating starting to fall off. Do you think it's due to a lack of people wanting to play it, or do you think people have finally started to figure out the Mono Green and Greasefang matchups, making it so that other more interactive and cheap decks are able to take over the metagame? As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you've been enjoying these videos. Until next time. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.